Indian Wars and Warriors East, Paul Wellman. Chapter 1. Columbus called them Indians. On the 12th day of October in the year 1492, after a long voyage into the unknown, 3 small Spanish ships, commanded by an Italian named Christopher Columbus, splashed out anchors off a verdant island inhabited by a few brown-skinned natives. Today we know it as Watling's Island, off the coast of Florida, but Columbus named it San Salvador, and believed he had reached the Indies, off the coast of Asia. At once he called the natives Indians. It was the first of many mistakes about the original peoples of the Americas. They were not Indians at all, in the sense that they were natives of India, as Columbus supposed. Yet so long has the name been applied to them that they themselves have accepted it, and though they were not Indians then, it is fair, through centuries of custom, to call them Indians now, when later it was realized that instead of reaching Asia, Columbus had stumbled on a new world. There was disappointment in Europe, for the new lands barred the way to the rich trade of China and India, which Columbus had set forth to seek. For more than 150 years afterward exploring expeditions were sent out in hope of finding a passage through this obstacle, until the Northwest Passage, as it came to be called, was like a dream beckoning men to far and perilous adventures. Yet though the Americas walled off the Orient, their discovery was far more important than any trade with Asia, important because of the undreamed possibilities of wealth and expansion it gave to European nations, important also because it spelled doom for the Indians. While it is etiquette to call Columbus the discoverer of America, it is now generally agreed that the Norsemen visited the continent as early as the year 1000, and others, such as the Portuguese, may have seen the New World before Columbus. His journey, however, gave it great publicity, for he brought with him back to Europe not only captured natives and curios, but something more important, gold. The sight of that gold, and the promise of other riches, set off a veritable stampede. Spain followed by Portugal, France, England, Holland, and even Sweden, soon had adventurers and colonists sailing for America. The natives they encountered there they frequently despoiled, and sometimes carried off by thousands as slaves. Sometimes also they had to fight for their very lives against the Indians. Always they found them enormously interesting as a race. In Mexico, Central America, and Peru, the natives were in some respects quite highly civilized. However, within the area now contained in the United States, with which this book is chiefly concerned, the tribes were savages, virile and admirable in many respects, barbarous in others, and they were so spectacularly different from the Europeans that they caught the imagination of the world. By no means were they all alike. In the vast forest of the East, the Indians lived chiefly by hunting, though with some growing of corn, squash, and beans. Their dwellings were bark-roofed, and sometimes protected by palisades. They developed the light, graceful birch bark canoe, their chief mode of transportation. Their hair they dressed in fantastic styles, warriors sometimes shaving the entire skull except for the scalp lock, which was ornamented and feathered. Other fashions were to let the hair dangle loosely, or even to shave one side of the head and let the hair on the other side grow long. In the southern areas, agriculture was more extensive and the towns more permanent. Dwellings were thatched with matting, grass, or palmetto fronds. Here the pirogue, a canoe made of a hollowed log, was used. Without exception, Indians of all tribes were fond of decoration, painting their faces and bodies, wearing feathers, earrings, nose rings, and other adornments that often gave them a terrifying appearance. A vast deal of nonsense has been written about Indian kings, queens, princesses, and even emperors. This arose out of the European's habit of thinking in such terms about his own rulers. Actually, there never was an Indian king, in the true sense, within the area of the United States, and certainly no Indian princesses, romantic as that sounds. Various names, such as Sagamore, Sachem, and Cacique, all corruptions of Indian words, have been applied to Indian leaders, but the general term chief, in the sense of a head man, is probably best. Chiefs often were temporary, but even when permanent, they had no power of law to uphold them, relying on custom and personal influence for authority. Where a chief inherited his title, it usually was through his mother's side of the family. Division of labor was a matter of physical ability. To women fell the tasks of the home, cooking, care of the children, garment making, gathering nuts and fruits, and simple gardening. To men went the hard and often dangerous work of hunting, and it was not for sport, but in grim earnest, with starvation often the penalty if the hunter failed. Killing a deer with a high-powered rifle and bringing it home on the fender of a car is one thing. Killing it with a stone-headed arrow and carrying it 10 miles on your back to camp is quite another. Men also made weapons, snowshoes, and canoes, built palisades and lodges, and did the hard work of canoeing and portaging. In a word, they did what was beyond the strength of women to do. In hunting and warfare, the Indian developed that almost uncanny skill in trailing, observation, and deduction of the signs about him, knowledge of the habits of animals, and how to use materials at hand for livelihood, sometimes called woodcraft. By these pursuits also he kept himself in hard and athletic condition. When food was plenty, the Indians feasted and were merry. They were great gamblers, enjoyed visiting, dancing, and singing. Some of them were fine storytellers. They liked jokes and had a strong sense of humor, and their mythology was often elaborate and even beautiful. Yet hardship was part of their daily life. Sometimes famine came, and they died of starvation by scores. Pestilences swept them away, and they lived in constant peril, from wild beasts, from the elements, especially in the wintry north, and above all from enemies. This brings us to one of the dominant traits of the savage Indians, and one of the reasons for the small population. For at Columbus' first arrival, there were no more than 850,000, and perhaps as few as 350,000 of them in the present area of the United States. Most tribes were warlike. They did not live in peace before the white man came. Almost constantly they raided and fought against each other, and it is only fair to say that the ferocious bloodlust of some tribes was to blame for white wars against them, just as the white man's greed for land caused many Indian attacks on him. Indians fought for revenge, hereditary hatred, glory, or simply for love of fighting. War was the chief, almost the only way for an Indian to win distinction. Some tribes dedicated themselves to war as their major aim. For example, before the white man ever came into contact with them, the Iroquois were engaged in destroying the tribes about them. That ferocious confederation of warriors within historic times wiped out a score or more of lesser tribes, a total of between 75,000 and 100,000 people. Of the Iroquois, Francis Parkman, the great historian, wrote, "But for the presence of Europeans, they would probably have subjugated, absorbed, or exterminated every other Indian community east of the Mississippi and north of the Ohio." Indians carried on warfare mercilessly, killing women and children of hostile tribes, as well as the men, and expecting the same from their enemies. Some tribes scalped fallen foes, though the custom was by no means universal, nor was it confined to the Indians. At first, scalping was practiced only by the woodland Indians of the East, and its general spread was caused partly by scalp bounties offered by colonial and other governments during various frontier wars, while frontiersmen sometimes scalped enemies as freely as did the Indians. Cruelty was common among Indians, and to show pity was often considered weakness. Frequently, though not always, war prisoners were tortured to death, yet the red man had no copyright on cruelty. In supposedly civilized Europe, more persons died by fire for religious differences, or superstitious charges of witchcraft, or various crimes than were burned to death in all the Indian wars put together. Among savage Indians, indeed, torture sometimes was a sort of honor, an opportunity for a foe to show his fortitude, and strangely enough the ordeal was almost willingly accepted by very brave Indian warriors in the hands of their enemies. Parkman tells of an Iroquois captured by the Hurons, who was addressed almost affectionately in this manner: "My nephew, take courage, and prepare to die tonight like a brave man." The prisoner coolly asked what would be the manner of his death. "By fire," was the reply. "It is well," returned the Iroquois. He was given a farewell feast, a pipe to smoke, and at the end of this he said, "My brothers, I am about to die. Do your worst to me. I do not fear torture or death." Nor did he, and under the terrible torments that followed, he was constantly flattered and complimented for his bravery until he died. Hatreds that sprang from such wars were deep-bitten, and often worked in the interest of the white man. Almost always the white invaders were able to use one tribe against another. Only in rare instances was there any sort of unity among the tribes against the common enemy, and it was always of short duration. Yet the Indian had many noble qualities. He was brave, enduring, and loyal to his people and his friends. He was athletic, and very shrewd in his own fields of knowledge. He had a natural gift of moving and eloquent speech, and in our history are records of powerful native utterances, such as the speeches of Corn Planter, Red Jacket, Logan, Pontiac, Tecumseh, Joseph of the Nez Perces, and many others. Sometimes it is true the Indian was treacherous, but he had a liberal education in treachery from the white man. We shall not in this book discuss voyages or expeditions of exploration, such as those of the Spaniards in the south and southwest. The Indian wars of this country properly began with the first permanent settlements of white men on its coast. In almost 3 centuries of warfare, the white man almost always had the superior weapons, the better organization, the greater resources. But he did not excel his red foe in courage, and with all his disadvantages, the Indian warrior resisted so stubbornly, and often so heroically, even when faced by sheer despair, that he won the reluctant yet genuine respect of his white adversary, which continues to this day. Chapter 2. The First Great Foe of the White Man. For more than 30 miles, from Point Comfort to Henrico's Hundred, just below the falls of the James River, the English colonist of the infant settlement of Jamestown had cleared away the forest and placed in cultivation most of the broad tongue of land which lay between the James and York rivers of Virginia. In the 15 years since 1607, when the first colonist landed, there had been great setbacks, but now it appeared that prosperity at last had come, and the 80 plantations, with their small homes, scattered up and down the 2 rivers, wore an air of leisurely, peaceful comfort. Men worked in the fields with hoe, plow, or axe. Women and children went about their doings happily, and with no dream of danger. Yet on that morning of March 22nd, 1622, an appalling horror hung over the entire colony. In the edges of the forest which surrounded the open fields crouched dark figures, Indian warriors painted and armed. They were of all the tribes making up the Powhatan Confederacy of Virginia, the flower of scores of villages, eager youths, braves in their prime, stern, responsible chiefs. All were as tense for war as a bowstring drawn to its limits and ready to loose. Among those warriors, in the pride of their vigor, walked an old man, a terrible old man. He was 77 years old. His hair was streaked with gray, and he no longer had the strength of the weapon-wielding arm or the fleetness of foot on the path which once he had known. But he had something else, a steady, burning, unchanging hatred, ability to watch while others slept, the cunning of a wolf, and the patience of a spider awaiting the exact moment to spring on the prey in its web. Wherever he went, all men turned to him, for he was held in almost superstitious awe and respect by his people. He was Ch1-3, the great head chief whose name was a legend, and this was the day when his long-matured plans were at last to bear fruit, bloody fruit. Gazing out from his covert on the white men in their fields, Ch1-3 could remember when the first of them came in their 3 ships 15 years before, the building of their cabins of logs, and the ensuing troubles. He could remember, and with a red fire of rage, that bewhiskered chief of the white men, him they called Captain John Smith. Theirs had been a personal feud, Opechancanoug's and Smith's. First, Opechancanough captured the captain after killing his 2 men, and carried him, wounded, to the village of his brother, Powhatan, where today stands the city of Richmond, to be put to death. But Powhatan spared the bearded prisoner, at the pleadings of his young daughter, Pocahontas, who later married the white man, John Rolfe, and was taken across the sea, where she died of smallpox. It was Smith who captured Opechancanough. The second time, the white chief strode into the Indian's lodge with a band of men, pointed a pistol at him, and marched him to Jamestown under threat of instant death if any of his warriors interfered. There the white men held him prisoner until the Indians brought many canoe loads of corn to buy his freedom. For the Indians it would have been well if Powhatan had killed Captain Smith in the first instance, and it would have been well for the English had Smith killed Opechancanough in the second, because the chief never forgot the shame of it. Yet Opechancanoug's hatred was more than personal. Powhatan had forbidden an attack that might have destroyed the colony in its early years, saying, "They are only using a little wasteland." But where the Englishman set his hand, he never released what he grasped. Opechancanough had seen the little waste land become greater and broader, villages of his own people forced to move to make room for tobacco fields, the forest cut back more and more, and the game driven away by the white man's noise. Other grievances piled up. Indians had been murdered. They had been cheated in trades. Drunkenness was fostered among them by white men, because a drunken Indian was easy to defraud. Some even had been enslaved to work in the fields. These things had festered in Opechancanoug's mind, but not until Powhatan's death in 1618 could he do anything about them. Even then, it took time before he could convince the tribes that he was fitter to lead than his lazy, pleasure-loving elder brother, Opechapan. So it was not until he was almost 75 years old that Opechancanough became chief. During the 2 years since then, he had devoted himself to his great plan, the destruction of all the white men's settlements in his country, that he had brought his plan to the present moment without one hint of it reaching the English, though it meant countless councils and endless plotting, is proof of the respect his people had for his commands. Now at last had come the moment. What exactly was the signal we do not know, for no white person survived to tell of it, but whether it was a shot, or the waving of a blanket, or the beat of a drum, at 8 o'clock that fateful morning of March 22nd, 1622, from their hiding places all about the unsuspecting plantations, Opechancanoughs warriors burst in a tempest of wrath. It fell upon the settlers like a lightning stroke. Yelling Indians shot down men in the fields, tomahawked women and their babes in their homes, set fire to houses, and carried off anything, weapons, clothing, utensils, or otherwise, that took their savage fancy. Within a brief time, some say only 1 hour, 347 men, women, and children were butchered. None whom the Indians reached were spared. In that time, all but 6 of the 80 plantations were destroyed. The 6 that were saved were close to Jamestown. Even they, and probably the town itself, would have fallen to the merciless savages, but for the warning of one Christian Indian. This man, whose name was Chonko, learned of the plot at the last minute, and reached Jamestown just in time to bring word of it. The palisades were manned, and messengers sent out, but only 6 plantations were reached in time, driven back from the fortified town, and forced to be content with the success they had already gained. Opechancanoug's warriors slipped back into their forest. The chief was furious at the last-minute failure that deprived him of his final, most desired prey, Jamestown and its people. He could do nothing more, and so disappeared with the rest. Now, however, came the reckoning within Jamestown as the full extent of the horror was learned. The stout English hearts only beat the stronger with wrath. Every man who could handle a gun was mustered. In companies they marched forth, leaving behind only enough to guard the palisades. As they advanced up the neck of land, their anger grew fiercer at the sight of the bloody havoc. They found bodies of their friends, worried and mutilated as if by wild animals, and these they buried. No Indians were seen, and having done all they could, the companies returned to the town. Sir Francis Wyatt, the governor, called his leading men together, and in a bitter council they declared a war to the finish. Companies were to visit every village within marching distance, burn it, and destroy the crops of corn. Furthermore, these visits were to be repeated thrice each year to prevent the savages from replanting their crops or rebuilding their villages. Every Indian found was to be killed on sight. Meantime, Opechancanough strove to keep his scattered tribesmen under his control. They showed, however, the usual tendency of savages, and, wearying of discipline, retreated farther into the forest. The old chief was far from cowed. By sheer force of personality, he gathered a large number of warriors at Pamunkey, a village where the Pamunkey and Mattapony rivers join, and there he bravely met Governor Wyatt's small army in a pitched battle. English muskets were too much for Indian arrows. In the smoke and leaden hail, Opechancanoug's warriors broke and fled in a disastrous rout. The village, which had housed 1,000 Indians, was destroyed. Opechancanough himself was reported killed, and the colony breathed more freely. Yet for 14 years the war continued, until both sides were exhausted. By a treacherous promise of peace, one of the Indian tribes was lured back to its former village. White musketeers surrounded it by night, and next morning massacred every soul in it. That seemed to be the final blow. By 1638, the Indians were so broken and in flight that Jamestown believed peace at last had come. It was a false dream. Fierce old Opachicanow was not dead. He had escaped to the interior, where he had hidden through all those years, still bitter in his hatred, still scheming to destroy the white men in his land. 22 years after his first great massacre, in 1644, his second plan matured. The aged chief was now 99 years old, and by far the oldest of any of the great Indian foes who have confronted the white man. Too feeble to walk any distance, he traveled from place to place in a litter, carried by his faithful warriors. Yet his mind was as keen as ever, and it is proof of his great force of personality that, ancient as he was, scarcely able to stand erect, and almost sightless, he still kept the confidence of his desperate people. Again, the utmost secrecy prevailed, secrecy almost unbelievable since so many knew his plan. A whole new generation of warriors served Opachicanow. By this time, he had outlived their fathers, but they still gave him their loyalty. The aged chief chose April 18th, 1644, for his great attack. Early that morning his braves burst, as before, upon the settlements, killing with relentless fury. In a single day, between 350 and 500 colonists were slaughtered. But Virginia had grown greatly in population, and the governor, Sir William Berkeley, was a man of decision. Hastily gathering a force, he marched at once and drove back the Indians. Once more the relentless counterattack began. The hostile tribesmen were hunted down, killed or enslaved, and at last old Opachicanow himself was captured. He was carried on a stretcher to Jamestown, to be exhibited in triumph. There a soldier, perhaps half crazed by loss of friends or relatives in the massacre, deliberately shot and fatally wounded him. Governor Berkeley himself went to see the dying chief, the old man who had seen nearly a century pass in his lifetime, gathered his last strength, and spoke to the governor. His words were interpreted as follows: "Had it been my fortune to take Sir William Berkeley prisoner, I would not have meanly exposed him as a show to my people." A few minutes later he died. After his death, Virginia had other Indian troubles, but never again would the colony be threatened with complete destruction. And be this remembered, had it not been for one small slip in Opechancanoug's plans, on that fatal March day in 1622, the defection of Chanco, who preferred his Christian faith to his own blood, Jamestown as a colony might have shared the fate of that earlier sister colony on Roanoke Island, which utterly disappeared, the details of its doom not known to this day. Opachicanow was the first great Indian chief to oppose the white man with deadly and lifelong enmity. He had his faults, vanity, vindictiveness, and cruelty among them, but he was, according to his own lights, a patriot, the first to grasp the dire meaning to his people of the spread of the white men over his land. There would be others, beginning soon, who would continue the long fight. He had been the first to launch. Chapter 3. The Puritans and King Philip. A neat little fishing smack was bobbing over the waves in a crisp breeze off Block Island, south of Rhode Island, on a summer day in 1636. Her captain and owner was John Gallup of Boston Town. As crew he had a man and 2 boys, with nets and fish lines, for already thus early fisheries were important in New England. As the smack came around a point of land, Gallop saw another ship. He probably recognized it, a craft somewhat larger than his own, belonging to John Oldham, an Indian trader, and one of the founders of the new Connecticut colony. "There's something wrong with that ship," Gallop exclaimed. She was drifting with sails flapping, showing that no one was at the tiller, although a number of figures were moving about on her deck. Then suddenly a canoe filled with Indians shoved off on the other side, and paddled hastily for the island shore. It burst upon Gallop that the vessel had been overwhelmed by savages, the entire crew probably murdered. Hard at her, he cried to the helmsman. As the smack bore down on the other craft, Gallop saw some Indians still on the deck, and opened fire on them, using 2 muskets, which the boys kept loading for him. One Indian after another fell, and then several leaped overboard and swam for the shore. A moment later, Gallop's brave little craft struck the other side of the ship with a crash that heeled it well over. Followed by his small crew, the Boston fisherman leaped to the deck of the Oldham vessel. Only 4 Indians remained on it, and they were at once made prisoners. The ship was a shambles, its crew and master murdered and scalped. Indians from Block Island, Pequots, had come aboard pretending to trade, then had fallen upon and slain all the white men. They were in the act of plundering the craft when Gallop arrived. Before a magistrate, the prisoners not only confessed to the attack on Oldham's ship, but added that another trading vessel belonging to a Captain Stone had also been captured and the crew murdered. These acts, they said, were in revenge. The Stone ship had enticed aboard one of their chiefs, seized and bound him, and demanded of his people a bushel of wampum, native shell beads that passed as money for ransom. When the price was paid, the chief was returned to them dead. The Pequots were a tribe whose name, from the word Pocatog, meaning destroyers, showed their fierce and warlike nature. The rapid spread of white settlements up and down the shores of New England since the first landing of the Pilgrims in 1620 had caused among these Indians growing unrest. It came to a head with Captain Stone's treacherous act. War began very soon after. In that summer of 1636, the Indians struck first, killing a few white settlers and burning some cabins. Then the English came to the Pequot country in a campaign short and brutal, led by Captain John Mason, a veteran soldier, a force of 100 stern musketeers, and 150 Mohegan warriors, under their famous chief, Uncas, who was ever a steadfast friend to the white man, surprised a Pequot village at what is now Mystic, Connecticut. A charge at dawn by the soldiers, and the tinder dry bark wigwams were set blazing by brands thrown among them. What followed was ghastly. In a few minutes the village was a roaring inferno of flames, and the soldiers and Mohegans simply shot down or tomahawked those who tried to escape. No Indian war party was ever guilty of a massacre more dreadful. Probably 600 Pequots of all ages and both sexes died wretchedly in the fire, or were otherwise slaughtered. The survivors fled from the country, and save for a few small bands, ceased to exist as a separate people. But their burning village was like a fiery beacon, warning other tribes of danger, calling on them for revenge. Before the snow was melted in the spring of 1675, some men made a shocking discovery. The body of a dead man was under the ice of Assawampset Pond, near what is now Middleborough, Massachusetts. When it was taken out, the body was identified as that of Sassamon, a praying Indian, that is, one who was Christianized. Shortly after, 3 members of the Wampanoag tribe were arrested, convicted, and 2 hanged, while the other was shot for the murder. But the colonists had deeper suspicions. They believed the murder had been instigated by Philip, chief of the Wampanoags. There was reason for this suspicions. Sassamon, who could read and write, had served for a time as secretary to the chief, and then, acting the part of a spy and informer, carried to the governor of Plymouth word that Philip was making a great plot against the white men. The chief could hardly be blamed for ordering the renegade's death. Nevertheless, the death of Sassamon was the first act in what was to be known in history as King Philip's War. The Wampanoags, living in southern Massachusetts, had a long record of friendship toward the English. Their great chief, Massasoit, had protected and even fed the early Plymouth colonist, but Massasoit had died in 1661, and things changed. He had 2 sons, Wamsutta, whom the English called Alexander, and Metacom, known as Philip, and later as King Philip. Alexander, who became chief at his father's death, lived only a few months, suspected by the colonists of plotting with the Narragansetts. He was arrested and taken to Plymouth. Not long afterward, he died of excessive rage and mortification, according to the English, of poison, according to the Indians. Philip, who then became chief, undoubtedly believed his older brother had been murdered. It was only one of many grievances, to whet his rage at seeing his people displaced, driven out, victimized, and despised by the ever-spreading white settlers. Yet he concealed his hatred, even signing a treaty of friendship, of which he probably did not understand the context, while he engaged in intense activity, studying his enemy, making plans, and winning other tribes to his cause. For 9 years he continued, traveling as far north as Maine to enlist the support of the fierce Abnakis, persuading the tribes of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island to join him, and even winning over many of the praying Indians, who lived in separate villages from their pagan brethren. Sassamon's death interrupted these careful plans before they were finished, but Philip knew the time had come, and retired with his people to his chief village, Pawcanaket, on Bristol Peninsula, near the present city of Bristol, Rhode Island. For a time there was an uneasy truce. Then an Indian was killed by a white man near Swansea, a hamlet less than 10 miles from Pocanoket, and everyone knew the act might bring on hostilities. Sunday, June 24th, 1675, was appointed a day of fasting and prayer, that the horrors of Indian warfare might be averted. It was that very Sunday which Philip chose for his first blow, and it was at Swansea that he directed it. Services were just over, and the people were returning to their homes, when gunfire was heard. The Wampanoags were shooting down the churchgoers. In that first flurry of killing, 9 persons died and 2 were wounded. When the survivors fled next day to Providence for refuge, Swansea was burned to the ground. It is noteworthy that Philip gave an order to spare the 4 colonists and their families who had done him kindness: James Brown, Captain Thomas Willett, James Leonard, and Hugh Cole. These departed to safety, but war at last had come. In New England, villages' drums rattled and armed men mustered to defend their homes, and here came welcome help, in spite of Philip's blandishments. Uncas and his Mohegans remained faithful to the white men. With 150 of his warriors, the chief fought well in the following campaigns. The addition of the forest-wise Mohegans was most fortunate, for Philip's tactics baffled ordinary military maneuvers. Wherever possible, he avoided any stand in which the white man's superior discipline and weapons could be brought to bear on his warriors. Like serpents, the Indians appeared out of the forest in swift raids, struck, and glided back again. No one knew where next they might come, but everyone knew that when they came, death and destruction were sure to follow. All New England was thrown into a panic. Sometimes the inexperience of the white soldiers caused them to blunder into bloody traps. Late in June, a large force of Plymouth and Massachusetts colony men located Philip and some of his warriors in Pocasset Swamp. They surrounded it, believing they had the Red leader trapped. Events soon revealed that the trap was the other way around. A few Wampanoags showed themselves at one side of the swamp. At once the colonists charged, and suddenly found themselves ambushed in a morass. In that bog, with the gloom of early evening making still darker the heavy woods, they lost a number of men, and managed to retreat with difficulty. Having repulsed his white foes, Philip and his braves slipped away in canoes up the nearby Taunton River. Yet at this moment of victory, the chief suffered his first setback. Paddling up the stream, the Wampanoags were themselves ambushed by Uncas and his Mohegans. Several of these warriors were slain before they broke out of the trap and reached central Massachusetts. By the fall of 1675, disaster seemed to be overwhelming New England everywhere. The Nipmucks, Penacooks, and Connecticut River tribes had joined Philip's war, and the Narragansetts of Rhode Island, under their chief Conochet, had taken up the hatchet. From the north, the Abenakis descended with tomahawk and scalping knife on the settlements of Maine and New Hampshire. Many Massachusetts towns were devastated or abandoned. There were hero tales in those times. On Sunday, August 1st, while the people of Hadley on the Connecticut River were at prayer, the dread war whoop was heard, and services ended abruptly. Men carried weapons with them, even to church. Now they seized their guns and formed outside to repel the foe. while the women and children huddled within for safety. On came the Indians, yelling and firing, burning outlying buildings, and in such numbers that it is small wonder that the few settlers began to waver and show signs of flight. At this moment a strange figure suddenly appeared, as if from nowhere, a tall old man with white hair and beard, grim-faced and fiery-eyed, with a sword in hand. From his manner of handling the sword and his way of giving orders, it was clear that he was accustomed to war and knew how to command. The colonists rallied. When he had led a charge, they followed him and drove off the Indians. And then, when they turned to thank their deliverer, he was gone. As unaccountably as he had come, he disappeared. Many of the people of Hadley believed he was a messenger from heaven sent to save them, but in later years his identity was learned. He was General William Gough, who had been a commander under Cromwell, and was one of the judges who condemned King Charles I to death. When Cromwell died, and Charles II came to the throne, the regicides, king-killers, of whom Gough was one, were hunted down, and hanged or imprisoned for life. A few escaped and fled to other countries, Gough making his way to Massachusetts and hiding in the home of a friend named Russell in Hadley, where he returned after the battle. At the time of the fight, he was 70 years old. He died peacefully in 1679, 4 years later. Not so glorious were other encounters. Captain Beers, with 30 men, marching to relieve Northfield, was ambushed at Sawmill Brook, September 3rd, and died with 20 of his men, a force of 90 soldiers, under Captain Lathrop, halted to rest by a little stream not far from Deerfield, and scattered about, gathering wild grapes. Suddenly a horde of Nipmucks, who had followed them all night, burst upon them. In the bloody action that followed, 83 colonists, including Lathrop, were killed, only 7 escaping. Hearing the firing, Captain Mosley hurried to the rescue with a few men from Deerfield, only to find the Indians turning to attack him. He would have shared Lathrop's fate, but for the lucky arrival of a third force under Robert Treat, which repulsed the savages and saved the survivors. The waters of the little stream, over which this series of fights took place, ran red that day, and ever since it has been known as Bloody Brook. In that terrible summer, Middleborough, Brookfield, Deerfield, Northfield, Dartmouth, Providence, Rehoboth, Taunton, Sudbury, Hingham, Weymouth, Groton, Braintree, Northampton, Springfield, Westfield, and many lesser places all knew the torch and tomahawk. Western Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine were practically swept bare of white settlers. But in December the colonists struck back. The Narragansetts had fortified themselves with a strong palisade in a winter camp in the great swamp of southeastern Rhode Island. There on Sunday, December 19th, a force of 979 men from the Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut colonies, together with Uncas and his braves, attacked this stronghold. It was cold with deep snow, and the swamp was frozen. With wild yells, the Indians opened fire on their enemies. A charge by the Massachusetts Company at the Single Gate was driven back with heavy loss. For a time the battle raged furiously on that wintry day, neither side advancing or retreating, white men and red falling where they stood. In the colonial force was Captain Benjamin Church of Duxbury, who had spent enough time among the Indians so that he alone of the commanders seemed able to match their stratagems. While the fight raged in front of the stockade, Church led his Plymouth men around through the frozen swamp to the rear, where he ordered them to pry apart the logs of the palisade. Very quickly the Narragansetts came shooting, wounded 3 times. Church led his men through the breach they had made. The enemy warriors charged him so fiercely that it was a question whether he and his men could escape being killed inside the palisade where they had entered. At this crisis, Church ordered the torch put to the bark wigwams, as had Mason before him at the Pequot fort. And now the dreadful scene of that former massacre was reenacted, with their village in flames, and the white men and Mohegans surrounding them. The Narragansetts thought only of escape. Some, their chief Conochet among them, got away, but hundreds died by bullet or tomahawk, or the flames of their burning dwellings. The colonists lost 6 captains and 120 men. It was the bloodiest battle, and perhaps the decisive one of the war. Yet, though this victory broke the power of the Narragansetts, the year 1676 opened badly for the colonies. Lancaster was destroyed by the Indians, while Plymouth, Providence, and even Boston were threatened. In March came a defeat with a grimly humorous aspect. Canachet had retreated with the remnant of his Narragansett warriors to the head of Narragansett Bay. There Captain Pierce attacked him with 60 Plymouth men. The Indians fought desperately and drove the colonists back. Hurriedly Pierce sent a messenger galloping to Providence, 5 miles south, begging Captain Edmonds for reinforcements. But when the messenger arrived, Edmonds was in church. It was not good etiquette to interrupt an important Puritan at worship, so the messenger, with more consideration than good sense, waited until the last Amen was said, the last hymn sung, before he presented his message. By then it was too late. Though Edmonds gathered a force and hurried to the battle scene, the Indians were gone. Of Pierce's 60 men, 52 lay dead. That was Canachet's last victory. He was surprised and captured on April 3rd and taken to Stonington, Connecticut, where his captors offered him his life if his Narragansetts would surrender. He would not even discuss it. When he heard the sentence of death, he said, "I like it well. I shall die before my heart is soft, or I have said anything unworthy of myself." A firing squad of 3 Indian allies of the white men executed him. With his greatest ally gone, Philip knew he was fighting a losing war, and on his trail, like a bloodhound, was his most able enemy, Benjamin Church, with a picked band of frontiersmen and Mohegans. Relentlessly, the captain pursued the Wampanoag chief, wherever report said he was, never ceasing and using every Indian trick, and while in the long hunt until Philip was dead. Connecticut at this time offered the first of the notorious scout bounties, which became a disgrace to civilized white man. For each hostile warrior's scalp, the price was a coat, that is 2 yards of trucking, trade cloth, worth 5 shillings per yard, and for every one brought in alive, 2 coats. For King Philip's head, 20 coats, and if taken alive, 40 coats. With his warriors falling away from him, Philip, like a hunted animal, sought refuge in his home forest, near Mount Hope, on the Bristol Peninsula. He knew the country, and hoped perhaps once more to throw his enemies off his trail. Church, with his picked company, was grimly on the track. Philip's wife and young son were captured, and promptly sold as slaves. On the night of August 11th, Church found the chief's camp in a swamp near the foot of Mount Hope. He placed his men about it. Next morning, August 12th, a single Indian was seen coming, and one of the Red allies recognized him. "That is Philip. Shoot," he cried. A colonist pressed his trigger, but his musket failed to fire. Then the Indian, who was called Alderman, raised his gun and aimed. Evidently the weapon was loaded with buckshot. At its report, Philip fell forward on his face, in the mud and water of the swamp, his musket beneath him. One shot had passed through his heart, another not 2 inches from it. He was beheaded, and his head taken by his slayer for the reward. Philip's death was the real end of the war, though depredations continued for some time, and not until April 1678 was a treaty signed at Casco, Maine, which then was part of the Massachusetts colony. With that treaty, the tribes buried the hatchet and exchanged prisoners with the whites. It had been a costly war. 16 towns in Massachusetts and 4 in Rhode Island were utterly destroyed, besides many that were severely damaged. No colonist was left alive in Maine, and New Hampshire was almost as nearly swept bare. More than 500 buildings were burned, and at least 600 white lives lost, not counting scores carried into captivity. But the Indians were crushed. Most of them fled, some as far as the Illinois country. And Philip, a doleful, great, naked, dirty beast, Benjamin Church remembered him from having looked on him in death. He had had reason to be doleful. He had chosen the wrong time. A generation earlier he might have wiped out the English, but the stubborn colonists were too much for him when at last he took to the war-path. Yet he left seeds of further wars behind him. The English colonists were bitterly to learn. From the Abenakis and other tribes in the future, the Philip's hatred lingered on after his death.